Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Stronger Controls for Change Order Risk. I'm Chris. I'm with the marketing department here at Clearstory. Just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping notes up front. We will be sharing the webinar recording with everyone here on the call, actually with everyone who registered for the webinar. We'll also share a link out to the risk control matrix itself following the webinar today. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to put those through the chat, or you can also use the Q&A module. We'll monitor both of those locations for questions as we go through the content here. And with that, I just want to hand it over to our founder and CEO, Cameron Page, who will run today's webinar. Cam, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, looking forward to chatting through this today. We're probably going to keep it to 30 minutes. I know the webinar is scheduled for an hour, but figured we'd give everyone some time back if you guys need it. And if you were hoping to skip work for an hour, I guess you could just pretend you're still listening to the webinar. But yeah, so today we're going to talk about risk and accountability control framework, and really focused on the change order process. But I think one of the key things with this is it's to really be applied to any business process across your company. And it's a great framework to evaluate workflows, processes, identify the risks, and then the controls to reduce the risks. So it's a good framework, not just for change orders, but for anything. And so hopefully that'll be one of the takeaways for you guys today, is to take this back to your company potentially, and use it maybe for change orders or for other things as well. So quickly on my background, I'm the founder of Clearstory. Before that, though, I worked for a large general contractor here in the Bay Area for about 9 years, doing commercial construction. So everything from fast-paced tenant improvement projects and ground-up corporate campuses and kind of everything in between. Before that, I also studied construction management at Cal Poly. And when I was project manager, one of my biggest challenges is I wanted visibility into my cost exposure at any point in time. And my biggest frustration was that for me to really get alignment with my trade partners and my client on what was outstanding is we had to share a change order log. And for me to get a change order log from my subs meant emailing them every week, putting them through the hassle of making sure that was up to date. And then me and my team would have to cross-check those every week to make sure we'd entered everything into our financial software. And so really from day one, the vision of Clearstory has been to really automate that process and create visibility and alignment between everyone. So in real time, at any point, everyone can know where change orders stand on the project, regardless of ideally how up to date your financial software is, but regardless of whether or not you've entered that into your financial software. So so Clearstory, we've been around for 8 or 9 years, and we sell to general contractors, specialty contractors, and owners, really anybody dealing with change orders. The goal today, though, is not really to talk about Clearstory. The goal is to talk about just the holistic change order lifecycle. We've developed a risk and control matrix that we're excited to share with you guys, but just know that each one of these is going to be slightly different based on the type of business you are in or the type of projects you do. And so at the end of the day, it's a framework. It's got a lot of detail in it, but it can be adapted and tweaked for however you guys do change orders yourselves. So what we'll cover today, really, honestly, being a project manager, I had never heard of a risk and control matrix myself. And so we'll give you guys an overview on exactly what those are, how you can build them, what the key ingredients are to creating a risk and control matrix. We'll talk kind of why the change order process is actually a really good process to develop one of these for, because it blends really operations and finance together to work this process to the end. We'll touch lightly on, probably many of you who are on this call, understand the challenges of the change order process and where those risks lie, but we'll highlight kind of what the impact is for each stakeholder in the change order process. Then we'll give you guys a quick overview on how we built the risk and control matrix. It's broken into different categories of the change order process. And so we'll walk you guys through what those categories are and the risk and control. And we'll highlight some of the risk and controls for each one. But the spreadsheet, which I'll actually just flash up here in a second, it goes into much more detail. And then we'll talk about how you guys can take this back to your company and potentially use it as a way to organize and understand other business challenges. We work with tons of specialty contractors and general contractors, and just getting everyone on the same page of hey, what really is our process? And if we all agree on that that is the process, well, then what are the key risk points and who's accountable for them in each step of the process? And so again, I think what's cool about this framework is that you can apply it to again any business process you guys have in your company. And whether it's a technology solution you're going to reach for or simply like just SOP improvements you want to make, you can really use it for both. Um, so yeah, risk and what is it? And we originally created this. We did a presentation at the CFMA Construction Financial Management Association conference earlier this year. And one of the advisors to Clearstory is the former chairman of PwC. And it's kind of funny because I know him because my wife actually worked for him in her past life when she was an auditor. And this is basically what my wife did every day. And so when Chris kind of helped us or helped me get the business off the ground and be an advisor for us, he kept telling me, he's like, this is a great process for a risk and control matrix, and this should be developed to go alongside Clearstory, but just alongside the broader change order process. So it was a really good learning experience, honestly, for me. We leveraged Claude to help create the final version of the RACM, but I can't imagine creating one manually because they can be quite labor intensive to actually build out. And so again, we've got a starting point that we'll happy to share with you guys. But basically the way it works is you take a business process and you map it out end to end. And of each of those key steps in the process, what are the associated risks? Like what could go wrong in the process? What are there areas for different issues to happen? What are the control mechanisms in place to prevent those risks from happening? And then who in the org is accountable for those controls? And so really those three things are at the top are kind of the key three ingredients to help map out each step. And then really, this can be used for financial processes, and really there's financial statement assertions that you can tie back to each of those things. So accuracy, completeness and cutoff, existence, rights and obligations, and presentation and disclosure. And so if you're a larger company working with an auditor, but even if you're a private company and you're the CFO, these are the areas that you can relate them back to how they could potentially impact your financial statements. And so again, starting to zero in on the specific change order process. Really, the high level goal of the change order process is you want to get change orders closed and move on. But that's really the goal. And with the workflow, change orders are, they can be generated out in the field. They can be generated through a design change. It can be an unforeseen condition. It can be a contractor initiated change. But so much of the workflow really lives below the surface. That's like why we, created this iceberg slide. And as it relates to the risk and control matrix, what you want to do is map out how are we doing those processes that live below the surface. So one, we can get them into our financial system of records so they can be visible and we can report on them. And then take them through to closure. So if that's a GC, that means getting sign off from the client, executing downstream change orders to your subcontractors. If you're a specialty contractor, that means getting approval from your general contractor. So ideally, whether or not you perform the work, you can bill for them. So a lot of the RACM that we've built really focuses on not just what happens in your system of record, but really what are those key processes that happen below the surface before they actually go into the financial software. So breaking it down just like a little bit further, the key components of a risk accountability control matrix. The first one is like the process and category. So what are the areas of the workflow that are unique and separate? And so for ours, we've identified 8 categories of the change order workflow. It's good to give each category and step an ID so it's easily referenceable. And then a description. So just simply plain language statement of what happens in that step. And again, this is an opportunity to get alignment with everyone. You write it down. Once you've written it down, everyone can read it and agree on it. Like that is what we do in that step of the process. And then not every step, but many steps will tie back to financial statement assertions. So what does this impact in our financial statements? If we have T&M tickets out on the job site that haven't been priced and we're not aware of them, how can that impact how can that risk impact our financial statements? Then the next step is the control description. So what is the thing we do to prevent that risk from impacting our financial statements or just creating a slowdown in the process? And then who owns it? If it's unclear of who owns that step in the process, obviously that's an area to focus in on and make sure it's clear, not just to the executive team or the people building out the RACM, but it's important that everyone who's executing that process know that they are in fact the owner of that part of the workflow. So those are kind of the ingredients that go into it. And I think like the reason why this works well for construction is construction is inherently multi-stakeholder and there is infinite complexity, as we all know. So on an average, project, there'll be 20 to 30 trade partners collaborating. There'll be a general contractor, sometimes multiple general contractors if it's a joint venture. And there will be a client who's ultimately, paying for all of it. And so that's a lot of complexity. That's a lot of cross-company workflows. And so that's why, this type of framework applies really well to many different construction-based workflows. And again, kind of drilling down even further, change orders are time sensitive. Ultimately, with a change order, especially if it's a forward price change, like a design change or a scope of work change that requires a decision in order to keep the schedule intact and not have to resequence the job, the faster you can close out the change, the faster you can make the decision, the faster you can keep the sequence of work intact. And on top of that, on average, it's about 20% of every project is made up of change. And obviously, we plan for the change with allowances and contingencies and things like that. But because of the manual nature, it's so easy to lose track of how many change orders are accruing on the job, what the status is of each, who's reviewed them, whose court there's in, and all that kind of stuff. And for every stakeholder, it's like a little bit of a different business risk. For specialty contractors, cash flow is one of the most critical elements of the business, and change orders are where they can get strung out the most. If you have a $100,000 contract, when you're going to be on site, when you're going to perform work. Payment cycle times can be painful, 45, 60 days, but at least you have some sense of when you're going to be able to bill for that work. For change orders, if they get delayed, they can age for 180 days if the GC isn't aware of the change that's been outstanding, and you can easily have already performed that work, having spent the money on the work. And so getting this process buttoned up so you can ideally do everything in your power to get the change approved so you can bill for it is going to greatly impact cash flow. The next one is just simply lost revenue. We meet with specialty contractors all the time, and the amount of lost revenue for poor quality documentation, missing submission deadlines, not having backup documentation can be really material. And it's different for every company, but it can be a huge source of lost potential revenue. And one of the biggest things too is change orders are emotional. That no one likes change orders. It does happen. It's part of the business. But they can seriously strain relationships. And in my experience, the number one way they've strained relationships is just when they become a surprise, when we're not aware of the amount of overtime worked, or we're not aware of the paint touch-up that's happening on the job until the very end. That's when tempers flare or the GC doesn't have enough allowance to cover the cost. And on top of that, really for all stakeholders, this is a really manual process. So it can be a big productivity drain. For general contractors, downstream change orders from the trade partners are really a cost they're receiving. And so it's the main area where cost overruns can happen. And the main way they happen is by having simply a lack of visibility. On top of that, the reason why I built Clearstory was it's very a manual or labor intensive workflow. You receive every change order request via email. You've got to save it to a file folder. You've got to open it in a PDF viewer. you've got to review it, you've got to type in the feedback to the subcontractor, you've got to track all the versions that you're tracking down, you've got to distribute design changes, and the hours that you spend on this scope of work can really add up. And then for owners, they want cost certainty. They want to understand where they're at in the job. And again, the main thing they want to understand is where they're tracking on allowances and contingencies and how much money is available. And part of it is also just simply being able to add value to the project. A lot of times, design decisions understandably get made later in the job or after contracts have been awarded, and they want to know where they stand so they can maximize the value of the asset they're building. And the last thing they want is budget surprises, or the schedule has to be resequenced because a decision on a change was made late, and so on and so forth. And then behind that, if they're using lender or equity providers, like they need to provide backup to those folks on their billings, and part of that is understanding the cost exposure on the job. So like solving this problem and making this as efficient as possible really benefits every stakeholder that is involved in a construction project. So again, like we built this risk and control matrix, and I'll actually just quickly flash it up after I talk through this slide. But this is a baseline. It's not a prescription. This is what we came up with. It's based on my industry experience. It's based on Chris Perkins' experience working with PwC. And we talked with a lot of our customers about it and got a ton of feedback on how we developed it. But again, it's a baseline. Like we expect you guys to go in and edit it, delete rows if they don't apply to you, reassign accountability for how you guys operate as a company. It is really focused on construction, so it should be relevant to the workflows you guys are doing today. And we really focused it on specialty contractors and general contractors. And so I'll attempt to stop sharing my screen and see if I can flash it up here. But this is what it looks like. And again, you guys can download it afterwards in Excel. But there's an overview page that lists out the categories that we've identified, how to use it, the steps on how to tailor it to your company, definitions of all the columns. And then for each persona, it's a build out of the category, the risk ID, the risk description, the traditional control process. And we did weave in like how Clearstory does solve a lot of the control processes. If you're already using Clearstory, keep that column in there. If you've never heard of Clearstory, feel free to like evaluate what we do and how we can help with this process. But ultimately, a lot of this does come back down to block and tackling. And so you don't necessarily need technology to have good controls in each of these processes. We just simply automate a lot and make it a lot easier. So I'll go back to full screen here. So the 8 categories like we identified are, the first one is like change identification and estimation. So design change hits the job. What is the process for getting it out to the trade partners to get pricing back, to review it, package it, send it to the client? And for the specialty contractors, what is your process for receiving that design change and turning it around as fast as possible? Item number 2 is simply CUR submission and logging. So if you're a specialty contractor, simply how do you submit change orders to your general contractor? How do you keep track of what you've been sent? And for the general contractor, how do you gather everything you've been sent and keep tabs on what's outstanding? Change order review, comment, and approval, everyone's favorite process. The reality is, as a general contractor, like it's your job to validate change orders on behalf of the client and make sure they're getting fair and accurate pricing. Owners are getting a lot more sophisticated as well in terms of how they review owners or review change orders. So GCs are under much more scrutiny to package and summarize valid change orders and really show their work to the client. And the better you can do this is a big part of getting change orders approved and closed faster. The next category we identified was field-directed extra work. So everyone's favorite process, T&M tickets. It is a part of the industry, and often it is the best way to track out-of-contract work. A great example is overtime. Let's say you need to work Saturday and Sunday. You kind of got 2 options. You can either get an upfront price for 10 journeymen or whatever it is, 8 hours each. But often what happens is it's a weekend and not all 10 people show up, or 2 people have to leave early. And so if you pre-approve that pricing and you don't track who actually showed up and who actually worked overtime, you can often wind up inflating the cost or overcharging the client. So oftentimes T&M makes the most sense on how to track extra work. Same with trade damage or paint touch up or endless other workflows where it's hard to agree on the price up front. A great mechanism to track the cost is the T&M process. But as we all know, it's an incredibly manual process today. It's primarily paper driven. It's the industry standard is that costs are not approved out on the job site. You're simply verifying quantities of work, but then that document has to go back to the trade partner's office. It has to get priced. That often takes a long time. And as a GC, you're left not understanding your exposure until you receive that pricing back, and then you have to log it, enter it into your financial software. The next category is like internal cost tracking. So, how do you track and forecast change orders as part of your job costing and WIP reporting? For a specialty contractor, this is incredibly important because if you're proceeding on extra work before you've been approved or before you've had change orders approved, how are you tracking that? Because you're now at risk for work that you can't technically bill for until that change order gets approved. So how you track it internally is really critical to understand. And then the same on the flip side for the general contractor. How do you know that all the change order exposure is in your internal cost tracking system? And what's the delta between what's living on a signed T&M ticket, what's a pricing exercise that's still in flight, what change orders are waiting on revisions, all that kind of stuff. Then billing and contract modification, how you bill for change orders, both as a subcontractor and a general contractor. This also does relate a lot to work in place. The next one is, less fun, but like contractor initiated changes, claims, notice provisions. Do you guys have a process for when that happens? Ideally, it doesn't happen very often, but it is, when the time comes, you want to make sure you know what the process is for your company. And then closeout. How do you close the job out and know that all the change orders are accounted for and done? And what is the process for formally notifying everyone that there's a window where everything needs to be submitted? And ideally, this is done before the job ends. But as we know, many times this lingers on long after that process or long after the job is closed. So I'll go quickly. There's a ton of text on each of these slides, and we're happy to send out this deck afterwards as well. But zeroing in on change identification and estimation, for a specialty contractor, you're working with potentially dozens of general contractors across your whole business. A project manager often juggling multiple projects at a time. How do you simply keep track of every pricing request that each GC has sent to you? And then when you're pricing it and estimating it, you're potentially using takeoff software, or if it's really simple change, maybe you're just calculating quantities. But how do you know you're using that project's approved labor, material, equipment rates? What is the process for that? And then as you're pricing it, how do you ensure that the math, hopefully there's no, if you're doing it in Excel, how do you ensure that all the markup and tax math and everything is working correctly? So identifying controls to organize and outline that for your company can be a big part of the process. And we have a whole list of controls that companies can go through to do that. The one thing that I'll say is really critical on this is, as a general contractor, when you send out a design change to 30 subcontractors, the trade that responds fastest is like the GC's best friend, because you don't want to go hunt down everyone's pricing. On top of that, the faster you respond, the faster your change order is likely going to bubble up in the review workflow. The downside and the reality is as a general contractor, you can only price things as fast as your latest subcontractor responds. So, because ultimately, if you're packaging it for the client, you need to be able to send a complete package to the client. And if 29 subs have responded, but you're still waiting on a critical price from the 30th subcontractor, you can't close out the loop. And so, unfortunately, even if you are the specialty contractor who responds fast, sometimes you're at the mercy of the other trades who haven't responded yet. So that's the general contractor's job, is to make sure they've hunted down each response. And so for the GC, what is the process and control to make sure you get that pricing back in the timeline you stipulate? And then how do you efficiently review and organize all the revisions that might need to go back to the subcontractors if you find discrepancies or the labor rates are wrong? And then finally, how do you present all of this to your client? The faster to get change orders approved is you got to show homework, right? Or show your math, I guess. And so, how do you have an audit trail that packages and summarizes all the revisions, all the workflow that your team spent, um, validating that change on your owner's behalf? And that was one of my most frustrating things as a GC is my team would spend weeks scrubbing through change orders, going back and forth with subcontractors, doing quantity takeoffs, making sure all the labor rates were right, only to present to the client and then be asked, "Did you guys even review this?" And so the better you can show your work, the faster you're hopefully going to be able to get that change approved and then get the change orders approved so they can proceed and ultimately bill for the work. And what I will say with Clearstory is this is a big area we focus on. So we have a module that allows you to review all the change orders inside of Clearstory. You can package and bundle the change orders for the client in Clearstory as well. You can send it to them in Clearstory. And we make it really easy to attach an audit log that outlines the whole process you guys went through on every single change. So CUR submission and logging, this is where alignment, ultimately happens between the sub and the GC. As a subcontractor, if you send an email, how do you know that the GC has received it or opened it? It might have gone to their junk email and it might be a $10,000 change order request. So keeping a change order log that you periodically send your general contractor just to make sure they have everything is really one of the best practices and key control processes to make sure you're not misaligned with your client. And then that document is also incredibly important because you want to compare what you believe your customer is looking at to what you're forecasting internally. Because if you're forecasting a bunch of changes that you think are getting approved in your ERP that's driving your profit and your job cost, but your GC is only aware of 5 of those change orders, and you wait till the end of the job to have that discussion, you're heading towards a way of getting negotiated down, and then that's going to impact your profitability on the job. So this is like a really easy best practice of just keeping a customer-facing change order log on each of your projects. Of course, the downside is like that's either an export from your ERP or that's a separate Excel spreadsheet that you're having to manually update. Either one of those, when you email them to the GC, that's only as good as the latest version you've sent. So when you send the next change order request or you make a revision, that log they have in their inbox is now immediately out of date. And so again, that's a big thing that Clearstory solves for is we have a cloud-based change order log that always is up to date, and your GC can access it from a shareable link. And the same challenges on the same on the flip side of the general contractor is how do you know that you have everything that's been sent to you via email? Obviously, you want to get each of these entered into a PCO or a PCI or a change event in your system of record. But how do you know what is not in there? And so what most GCs do, which is best practice, which is one of the control points, is when you request a design change or you sign a T&M tag, give it a PCO number and make sure you've opened a PCO number in your system of record. That at least starts a connection between what's happening in your inbox or on the job site, between what you're tracking internally. Many GCs try and have the subs also keep that PCO column like on their change order log, but it's really hard with, if you have 30 subcontractors and each of them have 20 or 50 or 100 changes to make sure that all of those are in alignment and up to date. And so again, this is like the primary thing that Clearstory solves. Like this was the whole reason why I built the software was to give the subs a way to communicate with their GCs and their GCs a way to automatically capture every change order request. So none of this manual reconciliation has to happen. But even without Clearstory, there's really good control points you can do. Simply ask your subs for a change order log once a month or every other week. And try your best to stay on top of logging every COR you receive in your system of record. But in reality, I've lived it. It's really easy to fall behind on that process. Change order review, again, this process really does bring in the owner to the process. But it's good that each party knows what their role is like in this process. So like the level set, change orders are exposure. It's not a competitive bid anymore. It is a single contractor providing a price. And so it is the GC and the client's job to review and validate those changes. Like this is where change orders have a bad reputation because everyone assumes they're getting screwed on the change order. In reality, most of the specialty contractors we talk to don't want to make extra money on change orders. They simply want to get them approved and paid as fast as possible so they have a smaller cash flow impact and can be more frankly predictable on their changes. But this process is where the cycle time on change orders can dramatically escalate. Um, and so each stakeholder in this process should have a clear understanding of what their process is for reviewing change orders and responding when they receive comments. Um, so oftentimes also what happens is the subcontractor, because it's either in their contract or, in good faith, they're going to proceed on that work. And so again, that's where you have risk being introduced on the job. You're spending money to perform work, and you still don't actually know what you're ultimately going to get paid for that work. Um, and so for the specialty contractors, like a lot of this is like email inbox management because this is where a lot of that workflow lives. Um, and some of the key things to do though are on the front end, make sure that the change order you package and send to the client is clearly broken out, is easy to understand, and ideally answers all their questions up front. I know it's tempting to have a single line change and just say, hey, it's 10,000 bucks, but you are asking for that change order to go through a revision because every one of my clients that I ever worked with, this is in the Bay Area market, they would, if I submitted that to them, they would say, Cameron, I need a cost breakdown. I need to understand the labor and material equipment breakdown. I need to understand the quantities. I need to see backup docs for the material invoice, whatever it might be. And so again, it's tempting to submit that single line change, but the more backup documentation you can provide with each change, you are going to reduce really for everyone the amount of cycle time that's going to go into that change order request. And then on the general contractor side, there's tons that goes into this, but some of the key things are really to make sure that you, at least on a project level, but really on a company level, make sure you're aligned on what are those key things that you're going to check for in every change order request and communicate to the trade partners early to just make sure that they're aware. Because if they're not aware, then they don't know what the client is like, and they might just submit that $10,000 change and move on. But if you make them aware ahead of time of like, hey guys, we are going to look for these 8 things on every change order request, and team, I need you to make sure you validate these 8 things on every change order request, um, is a really good control mechanism to get both all the parties aligned and the end client, to explain to them the system and the control process you're going to work through. So again, the RICM, we go into pretty good detail on what are some of those best practices to help manage this part of the process. Field directed extra work. I already touched on this a bit. You know, uh, Paper still dominates this workflow in the industry, and in some ways, paper is like really good because it's easy to whip out on a job site. It's easy for the GC to authorize it. It's easy for the GC to hang on to a copy. Um, it's easy to like edit it in the field. There are some pros to paper, but it is 2026, right? And I do think, digitizing this process, it's the time for our industry to really digitize this process. This is a big area that Clearstory focuses on. And our whole goal is to make it easy and transparent. And one of the biggest risks for everyone is that the foreman for the painting contractor, I'll zero in on paint. I'm not picking on painting, but as we all know, they generate a lot of extra work because people damage the walls after they've been painted. And as a painting contractor, you can't bid the job assuming you're going to repaint the walls 5 times. And as a GC, you don't necessarily want to pay upfront or wait for a quote every time the wall gets damaged if you're trying to close the job out. So just that scope in particular, there's inherently a lot of touch-up work and things that have to happen. Um, and the challenge is that things are moving fast in the field. The foreman or superintendent for the GC sees a damaged wall, and they need to get it repainted. And so they ask the foreman, "Hey, can you paint this extra wall? I'll sign your T&M ticket." So easy for the superintendent to move on to the next fire they're putting out on the job. Foreman does the work. GC signs it, they keep their copy, the foreman keeps his copy in the truck, they run off to the next job, then the next job, forget about it. And then 2 weeks later or a month later, they drop off the signed tickets back in the office, or they send a photo, and now it falls into the queue of the office admin or the project manager to price it. They have to pull up all the manual rates and they send it to the general contractor. And I've been on projects where there are, uh, I hate to admit it, but several thousand of these paper documents that get signed. And so the amount of, because we did a lot of overtime, and so the amount of these documents can also grow. And so it's a manual process. It's inherently risky. Um, and even with the manual process, there are ways that you can mitigate the risk with really good SOPs and control points for your company. So especially contractors, the big thing that I would like harp on with this is, even if T&M revenue is only 1 or 2% of your overall revenue, it's still an area where there's tons of revenue at risk, and it can be a huge cash flow impact because by definition, you are performing the work. Like, it's on time material. You've spent the money, you've paid the crew, you've bought the material, and now you have to go through this process of getting reimbursed for it. And so having really good SOPs in place with all your foremen, with all your office staff on how you can get these turned around as fast as possible is going to benefit your cash flow, because what it does is it reduces the risk for your general contractor. Like, well, we carry allowances to cover a lot of this stuff. Like, that is our job in estimating and buying out the job, is we know this type of work is likely going to happen. And so often we have allowances that we can cover the extra work. But if time to visibility is extended, we have no way of predicting if we have enough money to cover that extra work. And so on both sides of the table, this process can be very seamless, um, but it can also result in huge headaches and disputes and disasters. And so, on both sides of the table, like, there's really good, simple key controls you can do, even if you're going to stick with paper. With Clearstory, what we do, we have a mobile app. Subcontractors can create their tickets. They can send a digital signature request or have it signed on the device. The big thing with that, though, is that it's logged for both parties immediately. So we have a shared T&M log that both parties can see. So immediately, both offices know what tags are out there. And if a tag is going to get rejected, you can resolve it before it accrues and accumulates into a broader dispute. Um, for the trade partners, if they have their rates in our system, they can price those tags on the same day. So it's a click of a button, builds the entire change orders request package with all the backup. And so this painful process can be very much automated, but even without Clearstory, there's very simple risk and controls that you guys can map out for your business to reduce it for your own company. Um, Internal cost tracking and forecasting. We kind of already touched on this, but ultimately this is where the rubber meets the road, right? And if you know so much of the workflow that we've talked about is on the operations side, happening out on the job site. Getting it into the financial system is where it hits the finance team and becomes real costs that have to be dealt with on the project. Um, and so again, for specialty contractors, making sure you align on simply how you're going to enter change orders into your system of record. So do you wait until they're approved? Do you enter every pending COR? What statuses do you have internally to track those? And then how do you track and forecast work in place? So of the change orders that are in there, what percent complete are you on those changes? And do you know how much you're at risk on those dollars that have not yet had a change order issued for them? And then the same is true for the general contractor. How do you know what's been entered and how does it compare to what's outstanding, out on the job site? And again, with each of these processes, key risks you guys can go through and map out. And again, in our experience, there's common financial software systems that people use in the space. Most people call them potential change orders. Some systems call them PCIs, some call them change events. Every system is a little bit different. Every company's process is a little bit different. But ultimately, a lot of the key risks and key controls are very similar for every company. Billing and contract modification, this is an area obviously where once a change order is approved, depending on the percent complete of that change, it can be billed for. But oftentimes, there's like simple errors that get made during the billing process. If in the schedule of values, if the change orders are like down at the bottom, don't naturally inherit the overall percent complete on the project into those change orders if you've actually completed all the work. Or if they're approved change orders for future work, don't accidentally do the same thing and pull down the percent complete for those change orders and overbill. So understanding percent complete from the field is really the best way to understand when and how you can bill for change order work. So again, this is where also like the rubber meets the road, and through this whole long convoluted process, this is where a specialty contractor actually gets paid on a change order request. So contractor initiated claims and notices, like all three of these are slightly different, but you know, ultimately, if you're a specialty contractor, the first thing to do is just simply read the contract. And if you have a claim or you have a change order that comes up that the GC didn't ask you for, it's good to understand what the contract requirements are for how you submit that change, where it goes through, and how you get like confirmation that the change has been received. Several states have introduced new laws around this. I'm not going to say because I'm going to get the legislation wrong, but there are several states that have introduced laws on how and when claims can be initiated. And we'll probably actually add that into the risk control matrix because we're starting to hear this more and more from a lot of our customers. California and Nevada in particular just introduced this. And it stipulates how specialty contractors are allowed to get reimbursed for claims and notices, and what is the requirement on the GC side to receive and acknowledge the change. So that might be an area to explore as you guys are looking into building out the RACM for your company. And so, for each of these, I think, again, like the main thing I'll just go back to is just like understand the contract, understand if you're the GC and you receive a claim, what are your rights and what are your obligations to resolve it. And then if you're a specialty contractor, same thing. The thing I will say about claims and notices is a lot of times the root cause of why these end up going to court or becoming bigger issues, it all comes back to visibility. So often we talk to customers who have had change order issues in the past, and a lot of times the things that later became claims didn't necessarily need to, because had they been identified earlier, the work could have been executed differently. What I mean by that is, if let's say one trade is underperforming and the other trade supplements their work, if the trade supplementing the work is slow to price all that work and there's a dispute between the trade that's being supplemented, if you're slow to send them the cost, or you send them the cost when all the work is done, the leverage is kind of lost on how to resolve it. And maybe the trade that's being supplemented or can't perform or whatever it might be would propose a different solution if they understood what it was going to wind up costing them. And so again, so much of the root cause in this area is just transparency and visibility and backup documentation. And that's usually part of the contract. And even if it's not, like having enforceable backup documentation and confirmation are very much key risks in the process and areas where controls can be developed. And then closeout. I think, so many times on projects, it's super unclear when the deadline is to submit change orders. And again, construction projects are fast paced. And a lot of times the team's focus, and this was my lived experience as well, is like our focus was on quality and hitting the deadline for the client. And again, usually you have very good relationships with your trade partners. And so oftentimes change order exposure, maybe it's not known. Maybe you think you're in a better spot. All of your focus is on closing out the job and getting it done. You do the groundbreaking ceremony, And then a week later, you start receiving change orders or emails about open change orders. And then you go back and there's a mountain of work to validate. And this is a huge area where it can be really embarrassing with the client is you just completed the project, you're celebrating, and it's like, hey, we've got to go resolve hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of change orders. And so again, the number one thing with uh, with closeout and dispute resolution is like try to do everything, move everything left in the process. That's like one of our mottos internally at Clearstory is like move things left so you can close them out, resolve them earlier, like before the work or the project actually starts. Um, and I think that's like key to this process as well. But even beyond that, obviously, ultimately you're trying to get retention build. And to do that, you need to be in alignment with each subcontractor. So the faster you can do that, the faster you can build for final retention and ideally, move on to the next job. So going through this process and making sure as a company, we know what closeout and change order resolution looks like. What are the key steps in the process? For the subcontractors, again, it's like, be proactive. Like you don't want to wait till the end of the job where you lose all the leverage and you're off the job. You want to make sure that you're staying on top of it, getting them closed out ahead of time. And as the general contractor, 60 days out, 90 days out, send out reminders, make sure everyone has an up-to-date change order log, make sure every change order you've received is entered into the financial software. And of course, like make sure if it does need client approval, they're aware of what's coming. And so again, just to close out here, and then I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll give you guys back some time. Um, again, this is a starting point. Like I flashed up the matrix, and that's something you can download from the link we'll share with you guys. But the main thing is a couple of things on this too. Is it's broken into 8 categories, and you don't have to solve all 8 categories at once. And in fact, there might be one category in there that's like particularly painful. Like for me, T&M was particularly painful. And so if there is one category, it's totally fine to just zero in on that category and go end to end on it. Um, and align with your company and team. But again, the biggest thing I would say is just simply write it down. Like that's the best forcing function to get everyone aligned. Um, so you can use ours as a baseline. You can step through each category and you might say, what the heck is that step? We don't do that. And simply edit it or delete it or make it your own. And then there might be other gaps that we didn't spell out in the matrix that you guys have, and I would add those in there as well. And then once you have like the process and the risks and the gaps identified, then start zeroing in on the controls. And I think that's where like the most interesting part comes in. You likely have a control for each of these processes because you're in business today and you are doing this process. But you might simply find that and the way you should think about it are these kind of like questions in here. Is the control preventative or detective? Meaning, does the control help us prevent the risk from accruing, or is it only helping me identify it after the fact? And is it manual, or is there a system or workflow or software that enforces following that process? Like, is there a gate check that doesn't allow it to move on until that control is met? And then where does it live? Where does this workflow live? Is it email? Is it spreadsheets? Is it Google Drive? Or where does it live? And how do we scale it across the company? Um, and so that's it. I think the only little sales pitch I'll give for Clearstory is as a company, like this is what we focus on is change orders. And we didn't try and like reinvent the wheel and introduce a new process because we thought we were smarter as like a software company. We simply built what we believed are industry best practices, both through our own vision, but then through tons of customer feedback. And we're constantly trying to improve our software to make it better and better. But the big thing that we focused on was what do we think is industry best practice? What are the best control mechanisms? And how do we create transparency and alignment across all the stakeholders so we can solve this workflow better together? So as you go through it, feel free to reach out to us. And again, some companies, use us just for a part of the workflow. We obviously recommend using it for the whole change order workflow. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us, and I'm happy to hop on. And feel free to shoot me a note or connect with one of our team members for a demo. And thanks for joining. I'll check if there's any questions here. I don't see any, so I think if that's it, we'll let you guys get back to your day.